It's lovely to see you again, Jason.
Great to be here. Great to be here with Arutz Sheva, Israel National News. Thanks for hosting.
And soon enough, both of us are going to Israel, so.
Yes, I leave this evening.
So, Jason, in your book, you write extensively about Iran, the nuclear deal with Iran. I wanted to ask you if are you surprised that here we are, they've been negotiating in Vienna for such a long period, and yet there is still no deal, despite what we're hearing in terms of very far-reaching concessions on behalf of the Biden negotiating team. Do you think that the Biden administration, the one that wanted a deal at almost every cost, is ready for the possibility that there might not be one?
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, I'm grateful more than surprised. I think they did want a deal at pretty much any cost. I think slowly they're realizing you can't make a realistic deal with this regime. However, I'm still fearful. The Iran deal is a threat not just to Israel and its surrounding countries, it's a threat to America. And I think what we should understand from what's happening in Ukraine, imagine, Russia's threatening the US and our allies with Ukraine with nuclear weapons. Imagine if Iran gets its hands on nuclear weapons.
That's true. Well, President Biden is also expected to go to the Middle East, not just us, as early as next month. He will visit Israel. And reportedly, he is also set to make one stop in East Jerusalem and visit a Palestinian hospital there. According to recent reports, he is also likely to meet with the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, the same guy who just wouldn't pick up the phone from the White House just a while ago, according to the Wall Street Journal report. What do you make of these two stops in the president's itinerary?
Well, I certainly hope he ends up in Israel. I think it was a little shaky because of the Israeli government, but now it seems, at least for the moment, the government is intact. I'm not in favor of him visiting the Palestinian hospital unless he's going to visit it under the auspices of the Israeli government. The notion that he would go into parts of Jerusalem without the Israeli government and pretend that it's Palestinian is a huge mistake, and I cover this a lot in my book. These sort of things to make the Palestinians feel good is a big mistake. It doesn't bring peace. It's a joke to think that it brings peace. So I hope that he's much more careful with how he treats Israel. It reminds me when President Trump was going, one of the first fights that David Friedman and I had with others was people were saying that President Trump should go to the Western Wall without the Israeli government. In fact, somebody had the audacity to tell the Israelis, this is not Israel. Could you imagine that? So I think he needs to be very, very careful. As far as the visit to Saudi Arabia, I'd be in favor of it, but he's messed up the relationship with Saudi Arabia in a huge way. He's disrespectful to the kingdom, he's disrespectful to the crown prince. He said he would make Saudi Arabia the pariah that it is. And now, of course, we're begging Saudi Arabia for oil and everything else. So I think he should go, but I think it's going to take a long time to mend those fences with Saudi Arabia.
Let me pick it up from where you left it on the East Jerusalem part of the conversation. Under the current administration, suddenly this old terminology of a two-state solution, 1967 borders, settlements, all these terms are back in the discourse again after efforts by the Trump administration to always put a question mark after they were mentioned, if at all. Suddenly it's all back in the discourse. And I wanted to ask you, is it a genuine belief on behalf of this administration that this is an agenda that is feasible, or is it just lip service to the Palestinians?
So it's a mixture. Some people are just bad people, anti-Israel, will do anything they can to try to destroy Israel. And then there are people who truly believe that a so-called two-state solution is the answer. But when you push back, as I did and as my colleagues did when we worked under President Trump, and you ask them, what does that mean? For example, what does it mean for security? You know what you get? I don't know. I don't
Crickets.
know. Right, really, nothing. It's very embarrassing. You realize the more and more you push back on arguments, we talk about East Jerusalem. I don't know, for those of you in the audience that remember when they opened up by the city of David, the tunnel leading up to Har HaBayit, to the Temple Mount. There were all sorts of articles in the press that David Friedman and I were breaking Arab homes and so on, which was ridiculous. And then when I went back to the White House and I asked my colleague in the National Security Council, why do people keep saying that East Jerusalem belongs to the Palestinians? And this is a guy who's been working on this file for 15 years. Do you know what he said? Let me get back to you. And it took him 3 days of not getting back to me. And when I pressed him, he said very sheepishly, you know, Jason, it's just that people say it. And because people have been saying it for so long, it just is. So it's a real shame, and I think everybody in this audience who supports Israel and Israel's rights to sovereignty and all the places that Israel should have sovereignty needs to keep fighting back. Otherwise, it's going to be an overwhelming, the entire conversation will be overwhelmed by what's happening.
And language matters, as we know.
Absolutely.
You've been involved in crafting one of the most substantial contributions to the Middle East region in decades, the Abraham Accords. And on one hand, recently we see amazing progress on every front between Israel, UAE, Bahrain, even Morocco, capitalizing on the agreements that you helped facilitate. But on the other hand, only recently, the United Arab Emirates harshly criticized Israel amid the latest escalation around the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. They even convened the UN Security Council. What can we do, or how, rather, can we act in order to keep this relationship, these peace agreements in place in for the long haul?
So, and I cover this in the book too, we can't fault the UAE and others for criticizing Israel from time to time. You know, allies and friends can have differences of opinion. They have to worry about their own national interests, their own national security. But what I think it's incumbent on anybody who supports the Abraham Accords and who supports the state of Israel, go to these countries, show them what Israel's about, show them what Judaism is about, by the way. Make friends, do business there, and slowly but surely, you'll find that the relationship will be cemented further and further. It's really, really important.
Lastly, as a foreign policy expert, I want to ask you, what are you mostly concerned about from what you've been seeing so far from the Biden administration on foreign policy, and what would you give the president credit for?
Wow. Look, I'm trying not to be political here, but I think the world is a mess. Now, not all of it is his fault, right? I think on Ukraine, for example, we were slow to start, but I think he's doing as good a job as he can possibly do under the circumstances. I don't think he gets the credit for uniting the Europeans. The Europeans, if they can't be united on this conflict, which is in their own backyard, shame on them. But I think he's doing as good a job as possible. Obviously, Iran is, to me, the biggest worry for Israel and for the region and for the United States. And as we said in the first question, you know, the jury's out on what's going to happen there. But I think there was a lot of pushback the first time the Iran deal came about. I'm seeing less and less pushback now. And I think, again, here too, it's incumbent on anybody who supports Israel to open, you know, to shout from the rooftops, don't sign this Iran deal.
So that's what we're doing here. Thank you so much, Jason Greenblatt. Terrific insights as always. You can read more in his book,